Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Iran has alleged the U.S. was behind a terror attack in Sistan-Balochistan province that killed dozens of Revolutionary Guards. According to the foreign minister, it was no coincidence that at the time of the attack, an anti-Iran summit was underway in Poland. The U.S. wants to isolate and pressurize Iran, insisting it is a threat, though its own intelligence chiefs say otherwise. In today's program, we'll discuss U.S. policies towards Iran. To discuss all that a bit further, we're joined right here in our studios by Ambassador Javed Husain. Ambassador, thanks for coming into our studios and accepting our invitation. We're also joined in our studios in Islamabad by Dr. Tughral Yamin, who's Associate Dean at the Center for International Peace and Stability. And we're also joined by Dr. Foad Izadi, who is joining us on the line from Tehran. He's a political analyst and a professor at the University of Tehran. I should say, of course, Ambassador Husain was based in Iran for at least 6 years. Yeah. He's been posted there as well. So let me start with you, if I may, Ambassador. What do you make of the attack that occurred against the Revolutionary Guards and Iran's reaction to it?
This is, of course, a very regrettable and event which must be condemned in the strongest possible terms by all people who are interested in peace and stability, not only Iran, but also in the region. I think it is not good for Iran, it is not good for regional peace and stability. So this terrorist attack needs to be condemned by all peace-loving people all over the world. So, of course, Iran has alleged that some foreign intelligence agencies are involved in propping up, supporting and financing Jaish-e-Adl, which is accused of having carried out this terrorist attack, and which I believe, according to newspaper reports, about 27 Revolutionary Guards laid down their lives, were martyred. So I think this is not the first incident or first such attack which has taken place in Sistan, Balochistan province of Iran. Such events have been carried out by Jaish-e-Adl earlier also. And before that by Jundullah, which was
indeed
you can say the earlier version or earlier name of the same group of people.
If you allow me, Ambassador, before going to Dr. Izadi, I wanted to get your reaction to the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, has reacted to Iran's accusation. Specifically, of course, Hassan Rouhani has accused the United States of being involved in this attack. Let's listen to that reaction by Pompeo, and we'll be right back.
Americans had nothing to do with this at all. I'll say this. You know, many countries, including European countries, meet with this man Zarif. He's actually headed to Munich, where many European countries will meet with him. I would ask those countries, when they meet with Mr. Zarif, to ask him why he would say such an outrageous thing. Sometimes he's posited to be a moderate. It's not moderate to accuse the Israelis and the Americans of murder. That's not moderate. I think it shows the signs that Mr. Zarif and Mr. Rouhani are revolutionaries in the same way that the other leaders inside of Iran are as well.
Ambassador Husain, do you think that there is a possibility that the U.S. would be involved in such an attack?
Well, of course, I am not in a position to give you a definite answer on to this question, because it is something which needs to be investigated.
Of course.
And only after investigation you can find out as to which forces or powers are behind this attack. But having said that, one has to look at the history of Jundullah and now Jaish-e-Adl. There have been allegations in the past also that some foreign intelligence agency have been supporting and financing this group. If that is true, because that needs to be substantiated through some evidence,
of course,
that must be, again, this must be condemned, because terrorism in any form or manifestation needs to be condemned and stopped. And if any country is, or any force or any power is trying to support such incidents because of political opposition to the regime in Iran, or for other considerations, I think that is not in accordance with international law, or the UN Charter, or principles of international morality. And in any case, terrorism is such a heinous crime, and that no power, no human being, no group should be allowed to carry out such attacks under any pretext whatsoever. And certainly, as far as U.S. is concerned, we know that there has been a change in U.S. policy towards Iran after President Trump took over. Under the previous the Iran nuclear deal was worked out under President Obama, and with the inclusion of European powers and China and Russia. And that deal had been welcomed by all countries of the world, by the UN Security Council.
If you allow me, Ambassador, I wanted to pick up on that change you just mentioned. That's an important shift. Dr. Izadi, who I believe can hear me now, Dr. Izadi, do you believe that shift in the policies from the Obama administration to the Trump administration would in fact justify a bit of the allegation that Iran has put forth that the U.S. would be involved in such a terror attack?
Don't think this is an accusation, because we have documentation about the linkage between this terrorist organization and the U.S. bases in Afghanistan. We have pictures, members of this organization, its leadership visits U.S. bases in Afghanistan. Mr. Rizvi, who was one of the leaders of the terrorist organizations that do these type of things, used to get training in U.S. bases in Afghanistan. And they have bases in Pakistan, unfortunately. So this is not an accusation. These are all documented. Mr. Pompeo used to be the head of CIA. So he has ordered himself these type of terrorist attacks. And he is playing a game of not knowing anything when he exactly knows what the U.S. intelligence services have been doing in southeastern Iran. And the Trump administration, to answer your question, is interested in, they call it regime change. If you want to know what that means, you can go to White House's Twitter feed. John Bolton, who is a national security advisor, has a 2-minute video on the anniversary of the Islamic Revolution, the 40th anniversary, and he says that Iranians will not see many other anniversaries.
Let me pick up on that point then, Dr. Izadi, if you allow me. Dr. Yamin, do you think that all of this terror can be contextualized as part of the U.S. pressures on Iran vis-a-vis regime change? What is the goal here, do you think, of America?
If I was an Iranian, Waqar Saab, I would definitely blame the Americans for this attack. Perhaps all the apparent pointers lead towards American involvement in this attack. But having said that, I do not have any incontrovertible proof, and I don't think the Iranians have any proof right at this point in time. What they are saying is based on the fact that this attack has been synchronized with what they call as a circus going on in Warsaw against Iran. So by implication, the Iranians might say that there are American fingerprints on this operation. But I am a little saddened when the Iranians talk about these terrorists coming out from Pakistan. I think this is very, very sad. They have any proof? I think we have intelligence sharing with the Iranians. And if there is proof or incontrovertible proof, I think we should go for those terrorists. But I think with Pakistan, having a blame game with Pakistan, I would not. If Iranians consider me a friend of theirs, I would strongly advise them to desist for this kind of blame game. This would lead nowhere. But yes, I can accept when they say that the Americans are doing it.
Yeah.
They might be probably right, although it's too early. They will hold their own investigations. They will obtain forensic evidences, etc., which might lead to the fact that there were people who were trained by CIA or other people who were engaged in this dastardly attack, which I also regret very, very much.
Ambassador, I wanted to bring you in, and of course I wanted to get your read to what's been said already, but I also wanted to add this on. You know, we've had this meeting take place, this summit take place in Poland.
Yeah.
Where many countries gathered, and you know, America said this was supposed to be a peace conference, but it essentially turned into an anti-Iran conference where there were just anti-Iran statements made throughout. What did you make of that, and the fact that the foreign minister of Iran pointed out that it's not a coincidence that the attack happened at the exact same time that this conference was happening?
There is a strange coincidence. First of all, I would like to mention, you see that terrorists have been crossing Pakistan-Iran border and carrying out terrorist attacks on both sides, in Sistan as well as on Pakistani side, Pakistani side of Balochistan or our province of Balochistan. And I think the realistic assessment is that some foreign powers have been taking advantage of the space that is available there for supporting terrorist activities. And maybe their real game plan is to create a mutual suspicions, mistrust between Pakistan and Iran, in which if some terrorists cross border from Pakistan into Iranian Sistan and they go and commit some terrorist attacks, naturally, there would be suspicion that they are coming from there. And like Kalboshan Yada was arrested in Pakistan, but he had come from Iranian side, without the knowledge of the Iranian government, of course. But so you can see that there are foreign hands, hands of foreign powers or foreign intelligence, non-Pakistan, non-Iranian intelligence agencies, which are involved in creating chaos, in creating enmity between Pakistan and Iran, which traditionally have maintained very good brotherly and friendly relations, and inshallah will continue to do that. We should not allow, neither the government of Pakistan nor the government of Iran should allow these conspiracies by inimical powers, non-regional powers or others, to create mistrust and enmity between Pakistan and Iran. We should not allow them to succeed. Now, coming to the conference in Warsaw, I have of course gone through those reports. They say that Vice President Mike Pence made a very forceful appeal to the participants or governments that they should reject the Iran nuclear deal and work for regime change in Iran. Now, that is not something that even most European countries would agree. I think that is why I've been told, or I've learned, that the representation at the conference was at a lower level, not at the level which presence of American Vice President would have demanded. So, and the Europeans have left no doubt that they do not support President Trump administration's objective of cancelling this nuclear deal and start working for it.
I wanted to, in fact, Ambassador, put that point about the summit in Poland to Dr. Izadi before we go for a break. Dr. Izadi, just briefly, if you can, tell us about what your thoughts are about what occurred there in Poland, because not only did we have that summit, then we also had the Mujahideen Khalq gathering outside the summit venue as well.
Yes, let me first of all say that I agree with the ambassador 100% that when we say they are terrorism that is originating from Pakistan, we don't mean that it's the involvement of Pakistan in that act. Pakistan is considered a friendly country to Iran, a neighboring country, a Muslim country, and given the sanctions that Iran is experiencing, Iran actually wants to improve relations with Pakistan. And we don't see any logic behind Pakistani government being under any, being behind any terrorist attacks against Iran. But it's the unfortunate fact that these terrorist organizations go back and forth and through the border. We have drugs going coming through the border. We have these security problems that exist. And it's the matter of priority. And of course, the Pakistani government has been fighting terrorism for many years. There's terrorism problems inside Pakistan, in Lahore and Karachi. Occasionally there are terrorist attacks inside Pakistan. And the request that Iran has from its brothers in Pakistan is to also pay attention to this border, because when we have soldiers lose their life, we are going to have a funeral. This is going to create an anti-Pakistan sentiment within Iran, because where are these terrorists based? They go back and forth. So if the Pakistanis consider me a friend, my suggestion would be that paying attention to this problem that exists at the border is going to do a lot. With regard to the Warsaw Summit, you have outside the summit this another terrorist organization, MKO, that has killed Iranian president in the 1980s, has killed a prime minister of Iran in the 1980s, has killed about 17,000 Iranians in the early days of the Islamic Revolution. And they were marching outside the conference with full access. Everybody knows who they are. They had the pictures of the people who ordered these killings in the 1980s available at their demonstration. And then you had Netanyahu inside the conference talking about war against Iran, using the word war. It is supposed to be a peace conference, and they talk about war against Iran. So
and that's on that point. I will just ask that we go into a very short break because we are due to go for one. And I want to pick up on that point of war versus the peace conference, and that's an important point to bring up, as Dr. Izadi there did. Viewers, stay with us. We'll be back after this very short. Thank you for staying with us, viewers, as we continue this conversation about U.S. policies towards the Islamic Republic of Iran. We're still joined here in the studios by Ambassador Javed Husain. We're all still joined in our studios in Islamabad by Dr. Tughral Yamin as well. We're adding two new voices to this conversation as well. At this point, we're joined now by Mr. Mark Sleboda, who's an international affairs analyst and security analyst, joining us now from the Russian capital, Moscow. And we're also joined by Mr. Francis Ghiles, who is a political scientist, senior research fellow at CIDOB, which is the Barcelona Center for International Affairs, and he's joining us from Barcelona. If I may, I'd like to firstly start with Dr. Yamin. Dr. Yamin, before going into the break, we were talking about that summit in Poland, the anti-Iran summit in Poland. What are your thoughts about that?
Yes, there's no doubt about it that this summit gathering is meant to pile up pressure on Iran. Iran has emerged, as per my reckoning, as the sole power in the Middle East, which is standing up to the United States of America and Israel. And the rest, most of the people have accepted Israel. They have accepted the presence of Israel. They are not willing to do anything positive for the Palestinians. Palestinians have kept out of this conference, which is, again, a very sad thing, because this is a conference about peace in the Middle East, and this conference has not been able to attract the Palestinians. So all in all, this summit has a one-purpose agenda: to isolate Iran, to convince the Europeans to give up on the Iranians, not do any trade with them, not have any kind of commercial links with them. So the conference in Warsaw is basically an anti-Iranian show. There's no doubt about it.
Okay, so let's get the European point of view, if you allow me. Mr. Francis Ghiles, I wonder what you make then of this summit in Poland. Do you think Europe and America and their divide over their policies towards Iran was made even clearer through this summit?
Yes, without any doubt. I mean, the major European powers which were signatory to the agreement with Iran a few years ago, France, Britain, and Germany, have not really gone to the summit, nor has the European Commissioner for Foreign Affairs, Federica Mogherini. And it's been made quite clear that they do not agree with the Trump administration's decision to tear up this treaty. Basically, they think that Iran is respecting at least the terms of this particular treaty, although they may have many other bones of contention with Iran, notably about the question of ballistic missiles. But on this particular treaty, they just say quite plainly what the United Nations know, that at least on this point, Iran is complying with the terms of this treaty. There is another point, of course. It was always a risk over the last 20, 30 years that American and European interests would not line up in the Middle East. We've seen it on a number of occasions, but I think in this case, Europe is much closer to the Middle East and to Iran than America is. And therefore, Europe does not have the same strategic view of how to handle these very complex problems, of which Iran is just but one.
Right. So let me get a point of view then from Russia. Mark Sleboda, I wonder what you make of what's being called the Dueling Summits. You know, we had this summit in Warsaw, and then we had the summit in Sochi, in the Russian Black Sea city there. Many people saying that those two summits essentially competing with each other because obviously the Russians did not make an appearance in Poland. Turkey also did not choose to attend that summit in Poland. Instead, both of these countries chose to side with Iran, seemingly, at least publicly, by meeting it in Sochi over Syria. But of course, the symbolism here is quite important, isn't it, Mark?
Growing geopolitical divide, considering the attendees of the two summits. Of course, the purposes of the summits are really quite different. The summit in Warsaw was all about the Trump administration's hand in hand with Saudi Arabia and its push for war with Iran, and the absolute weaknesses shown in that drive with the lack of European support. I have no doubt that Europe would support military action by the U.S. Against Iran, but not under President Trump. I think partisan and personal differences have aligned the European Union largely over Barack Obama's legacy with the GCPOA against Trump. If that was Hillary Clinton advocating for war with Iran and breaking JCPOA, I think we would see a very different reaction. And just the European support for U.S. regime change operations now in Venezuela, I think highlights that. In the Sochi summit, which is of the Astana format, this is more focused on Syria, of course, and it is about Turkey, Iran, and Russia managing each other's differences because, of course, Russia and Iran and Turkey are on opposite sides of that conflict. But with notable figures like Turkey, the limited presence of Iraq at this Warsaw conference, it is very hard to see how the U.S. could launch military operations under the Trump administration against Iran if both Turkey and Iraq are not participating.
Okay, so let me pick up on the mention of war then. Ambassador Hussain, and I'm sure you've seen this statement by Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, who said going into the conference that essentially this was about war with Iran, though later he claimed that that was a mistranslation of what he said in Hebrew, but it has been proven that that is actually what he said. Was that, do you think, the actual purpose here, to rally more and more countries around a possible future war against Iran?
I would not go that far, but certainly one of the main purposes of the conference was to rally support for Trump administration's anti-Iran policy, which includes both opposition or cancelling of the Iran nuclear deal and also an effort or attempts to bring about regime change in Iran. These are the two dimensions or two aspects of current US administration's policy towards Iran. And this so-called peace conference in Warsaw was certainly planned as an instrument or as a means to achieve or make progress towards achieving those goals, which of course people in the region, most of the people in the region would not support. European countries don't support. Most of the world doesn't support. And I think it will be a tragedy if this nuclear deal, which was worked out after very detailed and hard negotiations between Iran on one side and P5+1 on the other, and it achieved a very good result. On the one hand, Iran was persuaded to give up some of its operations or activities in the nuclear field, except some stringent conditions on for overseeing those things, to stopping some activities and downgrading others.
Yeah.
And in return, the promise or the commitment was that all economic and other sanctions on Iran, against Iran, would be lifted.
Yeah.
Now, US has gone back on that commitment, and this does not create a feeling of trust in dealing with US, for instance. This is, I think it has hurt America's image, America's position in the world, because how will another country which is trying to negotiate with US on some important matter can be sure that if this thing is worked out with one administration, the next administration will not overturn it and reject it.
And that's a very good point, because that's the point that the Iranians have made a number of times as well.
But it's a valid point.
Yes, it's a very valid point. And I wanted to, in fact, ask, if you allow me, Francis Ghiles. Francis, do you think that that is something that the Europeans are also thinking, and that is why they're sticking by this deal at this time? Because it is a question, really, isn't it, of every country that's part of this deal and showing, their legitimacy and their authenticity walking into any such agreement. Do you think that's what's going through Europe's mind at this point, Francis?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this was an agreement concluded by the major powers with the sanction of the United Nations, and so it is extremely important. I'd like to come back on what one of your other invitees said, that Europe would be happy to go to war with Iran if there was another president. I think, frankly, that's absolute rubbish. You can't just talk like that. Europe has a much more nuanced attitude about Iran than America does. And I realized then, because my specialty is also North Africa and Algeria, and so the humiliation felt by America as a consequence of the hostage crisis has bedeviled relations, irrespective of all the other ingredients, ever since. And in the case of Donald Trump, it's totally irrational. He just loathes Iran. So he's being egged on by the Israeli prime minister and all that. But I think a lot of Europeans are far more nuanced. They do not like certain ways Iran proceeds in international affairs in the Middle East, fair enough. But on this particular point of the nuclear, they are absolutely clear that they want to stick with this agreement. And it is, because you come back to what your previous guest said, it's a question of trust. Yeah. If America can sign a deal with the major powers in the world and the United Nations, and they just tear it up, with a president insulting his opponents as he insults anybody, then we are in a world when we can't discuss anything seriously. I think this is a major problem.
Yeah. And Dr. Yamin, I wonder what your thoughts are then about that, because when it comes to Europe seemingly, at least on the outside, Dr. Yamin, is trying to stick by its end of the bargain when it comes to this deal, setting up, basically a vehicle through which at least humanitarian trade can occur, such as vital medicines and even food items, etc. But America is against even that. Why do you think America is against even humanitarian trade, even though its stated policy is that it's okay with that?
I think America is bent upon destroying Iran. If it cannot go to war, it will do so by other means, and one is obviously economic strangulation. It will make life so difficult for the Iranian government that people may come out on the streets. They may start protests against the Iranian government. And what the Americans want is two things. One, they want to restrict the role of the Iranians in Middle East. They want them to stop supporting groups in Lebanon, the Hezbollah, and also Syria. They want their role extremely restricted. And if it's possible for them, they would like this current Iranian government to go. They tried to do that with the Green Revolution some time ago. And they said that it was rigged and people are against it. and now they are trying to do it through economic sanctions.
Right.
Trump has tweeted that sanctions are coming. It was a reminiscent of a Game of Thrones ad.
Yes. Yes.
So it's sanctions. They want the Europeans to stop their have any links with Iran. It's quite another matter where the Europeans would pay heed to him in that way. Europeans as a bloc are not militarily very strong, but they are looking up at other options. For example, Angela Merkel is also thinking of having a new defensive arrangement in which they give up the nuclear umbrella that the Americans provided them, in which it was allowed that the German bombers could carry the nuclear.
Okay, so I wanted to, if you allow me, Dr. Yamin, hone in on the conversation about sanctions, because that's what we haven't yet discussed too much. So before going to break, Mark, I wanted to get your thoughts, Mark Sleboda, about sanctions, because you're sitting in Russia as well. Russia has also been sanctioned a bit since the entire crisis in Ukraine occurred as well as other such reasons that the West has found to sanction Russia. Do you think that sanctions against countries like Russia, like Iran, and others ever really work with the stated goals, at least? This really just affects the average person on the street, doesn't it? And that sort of defeats the purpose, isn't it?
No, that doesn't defeat the purpose at all. That is entirely the purpose. Because the purpose of these sanctions is to forcibly, I mean, these are unilateral, illegal sanctions without the permission of the Security Council. They are an act of aggression. They are, in effect, an act of war. And that's just what the Trump administration is doing, whether through sanctions or tariffs. It is waging an economic war with the world right now, much of the world. And these sanctions that they are leveling against Russia and Iran, it's not simply against Russia and Iran, but it would also be against European countries and companies that seek to do business with Russia or Iran. So they're in this point sanctioning even their allies at this point, or at least threatening to. The purpose of these sanctions is to force either a government policy change in favor of the United States or to through the government. And we saw that very clearly with U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo's statements about the Iranian government, that if they want to will do, and we're seeing this very clearly in Venezuela right now. U.S. sanctions are meant to topple the government. They are meant to make conditions for the average person so terrible that it creates destabilization and unrest, which the U.S. then exploits through covert and hybrid warfare to support an opposition and try to overthrow the government. It's unconventional warfare. It's right out of the U.S. military manual of the same name.
Okay, so let's go to a very short break, gentlemen. We'll be right back with the rest of this conversation. There's, of course, a lot of other aspects that are still left to talk about, and this specifically, this talk of sanctions is an important one that's just opened up. Stay with us for that. Thank you for staying with us, viewers. As we continue our discussion here about U.S. policies towards the Islamic Republic of Iran, we still have with us in our studios Ambassador Javed Husain, former ambassador to Iran, and we have in our studio in Islamabad, Dr. Tughral Yamin. We're also now joining two more voices to this discussion. We're joined now by Professor Joseph Siracusa, who is a professor of international diplomacy and human security at RMIT University. He's also the author of 30 books on U.S. foreign policy and nuclear weapons. He's joining us on the line from Melbourne in Australia. We're also joined by Dr. Seyed M Marandi, who is a professor at the University of Tehran, and he is joining us via Skype from the Iranian capital. Thank you all for joining us. Dr. Marandi, if I may, I'd like to start with you. I wanted to get your thoughts, Dr. Marandi, about what's occurred recently vis-a-vis U.S. policies towards Iran. Trump continues to insist, as well as his officials, that Iran is a threat to America, even though U.S. intelligence chiefs have publicly stated that that is not the case. What do you make of that?
In general, I think that there is a strong sense of continuity in U.S. foreign policy when it comes to Iran over the past 40 years. The general policies of Trump and Obama are not really all that different in the region and with regards to Iran. We have to remember that these same sanctions, which are targeting ordinary Iranians, were initially put in place by Obama, despite the fact that the International Atomic Energy Agency has always stated, even in previous years, that there was no evidence that Iran was pursuing anything but a peaceful nuclear program. And even U.S. intelligence repeated that on numerous occasions as well. But in the case of Trump, I think that there are a couple of things that are important. One is that Trump is known to oppose anything, almost anything that Obama has promoted.
Yes.
And therefore, the nuclear deal, or the JCPOA, as it is called, is one such element. It was what Obama liked to claim to be his foreign policy success. So one reason for undermining it was because of that. And another reason, of course, is because the heavy influence of Likud, Netanyahu, and Israeli supporters, right-wing supporters in the United States for intensification of conflict between Iran and the United States.
Professor Siracusa, I wonder if you agree with that. Do you think that this is about really just opposing whatever Obama did? Because a lot of that does seem to be how Trump functions. But at the same time, to go publicly against your own intelligence chiefs in that fashion when they're telling you, listen, Iran is not a threat, that does strike one as a bit odd. And what do you make then of Netanyahu's views on this, Professor Siracusa? As we well know, there's that whole controversy about Netanyahu saying, talking about war with Iran, walking into this conference in Poland, and then trying to walk that back.
Yeah, I mean, Netanyahu has made it very clear that when he attacks Hezbollah or Iranian or forces, supported forces in Syria, that this is one less enemy he wants to fight at his own border one day. I mean, Netanyahu's been on the warpath, and Trump, of course, has bought into this argument. Now, look, with President Trump, there's sort of a paradox going on here. He's making life very difficult for Tehran with the sanctions, and at the same time, he's risk averse. He doesn't want to get involved anywhere, and soon. So what we have is almost a zero chance of an intended war, but 50% of an inadvertent or accidental war starting as
and that's a very good point, Professor, because I think that's a good point, Dr. Yamin, to bring up. Do you think that much as Trump is playing with this fire, that he may not like the consequences of the kinds of pressures he is placing on Iran, whether it be an accidental war or otherwise?
Look, what I make of the Trump's makeup of his tenure in the White House is that he's a bully. He's a bully, but there is a method to his of being irrational or brash. He knows his limits. He will go to a certain extent. He is, beg your pardon, but he can be foul-mouthed. If he can shout down on people, frighten them, he can get away with things. But if people stand up to him, he will respect them to a certain degree. So in my personal opinion, he will not go to war. I don't think America has any more appetite for war after two disastrous wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq. He wants to conserve money. He wants to save money to build the wall to prevent the illegal immigrants from South America. Yeah. So I do not think he will go to war, but he will impose sanctions, very harsh sanctions, because he can do that. He can do that. The Iranians want to get around it. The Europeans want to get around it. They have this special vehicle, which is meant to bypass the American sanctions. And this is one purpose of holding the conference in Poland. He has been telling, Mike Pence has been telling the Europeans, do not trade with America. Do not trade with, beg your pardon, with Iran. Keep away from them. Do not allow them to unfreeze their assets. And one of that case has been thrown out of the International Court of Justice.
Indeed.
So world will also not wholeheartedly support United States of America, because it is not in the interest of Europeans, it is not in the interest of India, it is not in the interest of China. Russia is already smarting from the United States getting out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. they're about to let the start a new start.
If you allow me, Dr. Yamin, I wanted to, in fact, bring in the ambassador, and I wanted to ask you about that case, in fact, and I'm glad Dr. Yamin brought it up, because, in fact, there was a case in front of the International Court of Justice regarding Iranian assets in the United States. What do you make of that case and the fact that, the U.S. hasn't been able to completely block that case from going forward? The U.S. seems to be losing out, doesn't it, publicly when it comes to its policies towards Iran?
And the problem with U.S. is that U.S. Still continues to act most of the time, or many a time, as if it's a unipolar world, which developed or emerged after the defeat of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. For about 15, 20 years, this was the situation. But now the world has changed. It's a multipolar world. But U.S. does not recognize or realize the limits of its power. Because if it had done that, it would have been more realistic in its policies, in its foreign policy goals. Apparently, President Trump doesn't recognize or realize the limits of American power. America is no longer in that position where it can tell the rest of the world what to do and what not to do. Sometimes it might succeed, but there would be many occasions when other countries, other powers, other major powers would oppose U.S. Right now, they are facing that situation in dealing with Iran. The European Union doesn't agree with them. Of course, China and Russia don't agree with them. Countries like Pakistan don't agree with them. And so it is not possible for U.S. any longer to just tell the world, look, you have to do this, and the people will start doing it. This was the situation for a few years after 1990, but no longer. So this is one thing. But the conservatives and the hardliners in America certainly continue to hope for a regime change in Iran. That is, I think, the real purpose of, or real motivating factor behind their policies. I don't think they will succeed, but this is what motivates them. And cancelling of the Iran nuclear deal and reimposition of sanctions actually are means towards achieving that goal. As I said, because of the limits of American power, that is, and because of a multipolar world, I don't think they will be in a position just to tell people what to do.
So we just have just a few minutes left, so I wanted to, if you allow me, give our other two guests just their final words, if I may, from Professor Siracusa and Dr. Marandi. If I may start with Professor Siracusa, just your final thoughts. American power still in Trump's mind is a unipolar world. We are in a multipolar world, though. Is that a huge factor here, do you think?
Yes, it is. I mean, he can't have his way. I've just returned from a European security conference in Vilnius in Lithuania, and the European delegates there felt that Trump has overstepped his bounds. They don't trust him. That is, they don't trust his word one way or the other. But the thing is with Trump is he is so unpredictable that he could have consequences down the road. So it is a multipolar world, and I always thought it had been, as a matter of fact. There was kind of that unipolar illusionary moment for him, but it never really happened. But Trump lives in a very complex world, and as one of your earlier guests pointed out, he's at odds with his own intelligence and military community. They see the world quite differently, and at the end of the day, they would have to prosecute whatever decision that he is able to come up with. So,
Indeed.
But I think for the time being, we're in pretty good shape. But I'm worried about the accidental war that we don't want.
And Dr. Marandi, I'll give you the final word then. It seems to, though, be in the middle of all this, doesn't it, where it seems to be this fight in this multipolar world for positioning?
Iran is not the only case, obviously. For example, in Venezuela, we see that the United States basically chooses someone who declares himself president on the streets as the new president of the country. In fact, I think it is a sign of the weakening position of the United States that it is moving back to a sort of more 19th century or early 20th century model of hegemony instead of the rule of law and international law and so on. But I think Iran is very important, partially because Iran is a very important and powerful country. Very importantly, its location is also very strategically of great strategic importance. But I think in addition to that, it's also the fact that Iran is in opposition to apartheid in Palestine, and the United States is very culturally bound to the Israeli regime. Christian, many Protestants are evangelical Christians. Many of those are Zionists, and there is a strong ideological connection between the United States and the Israeli regime.
In order to... I will cut you off there, Dr. Marandi. I do apologize. The clock has gotten the best of us, but of course we do sincerely appreciate your time and your insight analysis. I'd like to thank, of course, all of our guests who have joined us for this session as well. We were talking there to Dr. Seyed M Marandi, professor at the University of Tehran. We were also joined by Professor Joseph Siracusa, Professor of International Diplomacy, speaking to us from Melbourne. We were joined by, of course, Ambassador Javed Husain, speaking to us live from right here in our studios in Lahore. He's a former ambassador to Iran. We were also joined in our studios in Islamabad by Dr. Tughral Yamin, who is an associate dean at CIPS. Earlier, we were joined by Dr. Foad Izadi of the University of Tehran as well. He's a professor there, and Mark Sleboda, international affairs and security analyst, who had been speaking to us live from Moscow, and Francis Ghiles, senior research fellow at the Barcelona Center for International Affairs. Now, viewers, as all of our guests there have spoken about, when it comes to this relationship and foreign policies of the United States towards the Islamic Republic of Iran, we can go all the way back to the Islamic Revolution in 1979 and see the timeline from then onwards. The most latest attacks that happened in Sistan Balochistan in Iran, coupled with, of course, the summit that took place in Poland and other such events, are very important indicators of where this relationship is at right now. And of course, this divide between the United States and Europe over this nuclear deal is a vital issue at this point in time as well. We'll keep a very close eye on all those developments and more here in The Scope. But thanks for watching this edition. I've been Waqar Rizvi.